Hello everyone, my name is Vincenza Bartholomew and I am a graduate research assistant for the Urban Catholic Teacher Corps, and this video today is coming to you with a partnership from the Archdiocese of Boston along with Boston College to educate teachers on special education topics, specifically in Catholic schools. Today we have Allison Naman with us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a doctoral student here at Boston College. Also a longtime special educator, and I teach some of the master's level special education classes here at BC.
So today we're going to talk a bit about learning disabilities. So Allison, can you tell me what learning disabilities are, the different types, and then some strategies?
Sure. So learning disabilities is a little bit more complicated than some that we've talked about before. There are lots of definitions of learning disabilities, and they don't all necessarily agree. So I'm not going to give you those technical definitions, but what I am going to do is kind of condense it to say that what everyone does agree on is that learning disabilities are an unexpected failure to learn. We all agree that learning disabilities are not caused by other disabilities, although they can occur together. They're not caused by insufficient or inappropriate teaching. They're not caused by cultural or linguistic diversity, and they're not caused by limited access to resources, which is kind of a proxy that we use for socioeconomic status. So that's kind of like a basic definition, but there are three different types of learning disabilities that we tend to see in classes. Students can have like a generalized learning disability that covers all three, or they can have just one particular type. So thought I might tell you one kind and give you some strategies, and tell you another and give you some strategies.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
That's great.
So the first one we're going to talk about is the one that probably most people are familiar with, which is a reading impairment, or a lot of times it's called dyslexia. And typically the characteristics that distinguish dyslexia, we want to make sure that you know it's not just a delay. Dyslexia means it's a persistent deficit. So if students are able over time to catch up in reading, then that's not necessarily dyslexia. Dyslexia is going to continue across the lifespan. It has a phonological basis. So what this means is that students have a hard time associating letters and sounds. They might have a hard time seeing it and knowing what sound is. They also tend to have a really hard time with rhyming. Interestingly, that's one of the earliest predictors of dyslexia. Before kids are even at an age where they're starting to read, they're having trouble rhyming. It's a good indication that we need to be watching for dyslexia later on. They have trouble with letter recognition, so simply naming the letters when they see them. They have a hard time pronouncing words out of context. So sometimes they'll use those context clues, but if you give them an isolated word, or if you give them like a nonsense word, they have a hard time applying the rules of phonetics to sound that word out. This also then, of course, leads to problems with fluency, with comprehension, and also with spelling and writing as well. Some of the things that teachers can do in the classroom to support students with dyslexia, particularly in the early grades when they're trying to learn to read, we want to use a highly structured phonics program. And there are a lot of them available that have been shown to work really well for students with dyslexia, like Wilson Reading or Orton Gillingham. The kind you use doesn't really matter. We just want to make sure it's heavily phonics based. Okay. We want to use reading and writing instruction in tandem because reading and that issue with phonetics impacts writing quite a bit. We want to have students writing what they're reading, reading what they're writing, and make sure that we're not kind of ignoring one to focus on the other. Instruction needs to be really intensive. Whatever you're doing in a regular classroom is probably not going to be enough to get students who are dyslexic where they need to be. Or even in a non-reading subject, they're still going to need some extra support if they're doing a lot of learning by reading. We want to teach for automaticity until they're accurate and fluent. So what this means is we do want to work on things like segmenting and blending, sounding out and then putting our sounds back together. But for a lot of kids with dyslexia, this is such a difficult skill that really in the early stages we're teaching almost everything as though it's a sight word. So it's not that they sound out the word she, it's that they look at it and they know it's the word she. And that's okay for students with dyslexia because they're really going to pick up a lot of things if we're okay with them using them as sight words. Finally, we can use cognitive strategies for reading comprehension. When students are struggling with decoding, that process of sounding out the words and figuring out what the words are, they kind of lose some of the comprehension because they're not really reading along at a normal pace, and they're spending so much of their energies on decoding that they're not thinking about what they're reading. So there are a lot of cognitive strategies out there that you can use. Some of them are things like CAPS, I think, is one. Character, what's the aim, what's the purpose. You know, there's several of them that can easily be Googled, but those strategies can work really well for comprehension also. Shifting now into writing impairment, we don't always call it dysgraphia, but that is a synonymous term. Dysgraphia is simply difficulty with written expression, and this includes both the content of what is written, meaning they might have a hard time figuring out what it is they want to write. So one thing that we'll see a lot of times in elementary age students is when they get that Monday prompt, you know, write about what you did this weekend, and every time they're telling you the very same thing, it's because they're having trouble coming up with novel content. Probably they didn't actually do that thing over the weekend, but it's something that they know that they can write about. So we have trouble with content. We also tend to have problems with legibility. So this is based in fine motor and visual spatial abilities, but the two do tend to go hand in hand. So you'll see a lot of misformed letters. You'll see everything kind of run together and not a lot of spacing between words. So we kind of work on the form and the function with dysgraphia. In working on dysgraphia, it's important to kind of use a natural progression of skills. So the first thing that we want to address is that form part of actually working on the writing, forming of the letters and the spacing. Spelling can tie in there as well. Then we're going to be worried more about the content of what's being written. So what is it that you are trying to convey? And then finally, this function of writing as a form of communication. You're writing to convince, you're writing to inform. And that's kind of how we want to build writing skills. Graphic organizers can be really helpful. There are tons of them available depending on the type of writing to be done. Some help pull notes from a reading passage. Some just help them get their ideas on paper. You know, there's one that looks like a hamburger, so that the buns are the introduction and the conclusion, and then the filling is all of the details. And these are all great organizers. And then strategies work as well. One of the more common ones is POWER. So for the writing process, plan, organize, write, edit, revise. Any strategies like that can work really well. And then we have dyscalculia, or learning disability in mathematics. So dyslexia and dysgraphia tend to be fairly similar in that there's only so many components to reading and so many components to writing. Math is a much more complicated process. So there are lots of different kind of ways that we see dyscalculia manifesting with students. The other thing to say about dyscalculia is we know that there are a lot of students who struggle with math, but typically only the most severe end up being diagnosed with a learning disability. These strategies can work either way. Okay. So we don't need to discriminate with the term or with not the term. If a student's challenged, you know, feel free to use some of these strategies. So the characteristics of learning disability in math you might see, they're challenged by spatial orientation, meaning they're having a hard time lining up their numbers correctly. They miss details. They don't see a decimal point or a negative sign. Procedural errors, so if they're doing a multi-step problem, they miss a step, or they forget, you know, borrowing or regrouping or something like that. They might forget one of the pieces of that process. They have a hard time shifting from one type of problem to the next. So if you give them a worksheet that has addition and subtraction, you might see them doing them all, whatever that first one was, right? So that part of that's inattention to detail, and part of it's that they're just not shifting back and forth between the operations. They struggle with memory and with retention, so we really see that with math facts. Even at a very early level, they're having a hard time. They never really memorize the addition or the multiplication facts. They have trouble with mathematical reasoning, so they have a hard time knowing which operation to choose. Should they add? Should they subtract? They also have a hard time figuring out if their answer makes sense, right? So if you give them a problem, John has 3 apples and Bob has 5 apples, and how many apples do they have together? And somehow they get 100. You're like, you know, he had only how many he could hold, and he had how many only he could hold. Does 100 seem reasonable? And they say, yeah, that's what I got. That's reasonable, right? So that just logic and understanding piece is kind of missing. Finally, they struggle with mathematical language and representation. So this might be the vocabulary or the terms that are used, even at a basic level, or it's converting from concrete to the representational. So sometimes even seeing 5 circles and knowing that the number 5 means the same thing, sometimes that can be a challenge as well. So there are a lot of strategies that we can use. Most of these tend to be things that you can use together. You don't have to use these in isolation. So we want to make sure that students have the prior knowledge that they need, because math builds on itself. If you're missing a foundational step, it's hard to move forward from there. The concrete to abstract shift is really important. So students particularly are struggling with that symbolic representation, starting in concrete. So give them 5 counting bears. Give them 3 counting bears. Okay, how many counting bears do we have altogether? Then we go to a representational picture. So we might draw 5 smiley faces and 3 smiley faces. All right, how many do we have? Then we shift 5 plus 3 equals. So kind of building that progression is helpful. Task analysis is important. Even what seems like a one-step problem is rarely a one-step problem, right? We've got to get our numbers lined up. We have to figure out our place values. So making sure that we're intentional to cover every little step of a problem that needs to be worked. We want to insist that students read and try to understand problems. I can't tell you how many students I've worked with dyscalculia. And you give them a worksheet of stuff that they've been doing for a week, and they look at it and they panic. You think, you haven't even read this yet. Like, it's too early to panic. So they need to at least read it and try to think about what it means. If they need to ask for help after that, then that's fine. But they've taken that initial step on their own. Real world problems are helpful. Number 1, it increases motivation. Number 2, it helps put application in and give context to the problems that they're working. We want to use lots and lots of practice. It takes a lot more repetition for students with learning disabilities to understand and being able to then perform a process than it does for their peers. So they need lots of practice to get to the point of mastery. We want to use periodic review. Math is not like riding a bike. If you don't use it, you will in fact lose it. So, as we kind of move forward concept to concept throughout a year, if we don't cycle back to some of those earlier concepts, they're going to lose them completely. So just occasionally kind of throw in some extra problems. Differentiated instruction and assignments are okay. It's okay to say to Jill, you know what, I want you to do 1 through 10 for homework, and to say to Sue, I want you to do 1 through 8. I think 9 and 10 are problems we need to work on together. And that's okay. The other thing that can be beneficial is partial credit. So what I used to do in the classroom was half credit for the process and half credit for the math. So if you understood what you were supposed to do, but maybe the math fell apart, half credit. If you had the wrong process, but you did it correctly, half credit. So students are getting a little something for what they're putting in, and it helps them figure out where it is that they kind of went wrong with that problem. Wrapping up, a few other challenges that we tend to see with learning disabilities. These aren't necessarily diagnostic criteria, but they occur with learning disabilities often enough that we say that they're associated, just so that you're not surprised or thinking, oh, is this another thing? This is still part of learning disability. So they have trouble with knowledge retention. They'll do something well for you 10 times on Tuesday, and then they come in on Wednesday like they've never heard of it before. That's learning disability. They struggle with self-regulated learning, so that idea of planning a task, monitoring their performance, and then at the end kind of evaluating how well they did. They really struggle to do that independently. They have a hard time with organization. Their stuff is everywhere. They lose things. They forget things at home. All part of LD. This idea of mastery motivation versus learned helplessness. Mastery motivation is kind of our inherent drive to conquer something. We see with students with LD a lot of times that's lacking. They don't have that desire to learn. They don't have that desire to move forward and figure out. They're totally okay with this learned helplessness, just saying like, somebody else is going to do it for me. So we kind of have to figure out how to shift them a little from one back to the other. And then social skills. This isn't going to be an overt problem with social skills, but those more subtle social clues they're going to miss out on sometimes. So just to kind of keep an eye and an ear out for students, it has more of an impact than just reading, writing, and math.
Wonderful. Well, I definitely learned a lot, so I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. Thank you, Alex. And
Happy to do it.
thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video today. It was brought to you by the Urban Catholic Teacher Corps in conjunction with the Archdiocese of Boston and faculty from Boston College. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about the Special Education Professional Development Initiative, reach out to us at these options here. Thank you.